I like the term smart communities, obviously, because there is a much more human as well as humane dimension to it. But smart, in a way, is often translated in common parlance to be about technology and a whole bunch of innovative ways that, algorithms can create automation and optimization and efficiencies and all these big words. Whereas I think what I would consider to be really smart is if a community actually realizes what would be a very progressive governance model for us. So the smartest things or the most exciting things from a research point of view that we are looking at right now are not so much about any one piece of technology. It's actually about really interesting ideas for governance.
Hi, Smart Community friends. In this episode of the Smart Community Podcast, I had a really interesting conversation with Marcus Foth, a professor at QUT in Brisbane in the Creative Industries Faculty Design Lab. You might remember that Marcus was one of our very first guests on the podcast back in episode number 4 in 2018. And actually, Marcus introduced me to a lot of our early guests, so thanks, Marcus, for that. In this episode, we touch on Marcus's background and his current work across interactive design, as well as how his passion for creating a better world involves tackling things such as sustainability, resilience, climate change, circular economy, and data. We talk about the importance of good governance models to create smart cities and discuss the difference between security and privacy. Marcus then shares with us the Data Care initiative and the sustainability projects he's currently working on. We finish our conversation talking about the emerging trends of the more than human theme and data sovereignty, before Marcus shares how government and industry are beginning to recognize the importance of a holistic sustainability approach. As always, we hope you enjoy listening to this episode as much as we enjoyed making it.
Welcome to the smart community, smart regions, smart towns, and smart cities. It's where we live, work, and play. With smart communities, the future starts today. Big data, smart mobility, emerging trends galore. The Smart Community Podcast is what you're looking for.
Hello, Marcus. How are you today?
Very good. I'm very well caffeinated, so happy to race through the next 30 minutes of this podcast. Thanks for having me, Zoe.
No, I'm also well caffeinated, so we are ready to go. Let's jump straight in. And can you tell us about your background and what you're passionate about?
Sure. My background is originally in computer science, but for the last probably by now 2 decades, I've been a professor at QUT in the Creative Industries faculty and specifically in the design lab. So my work these days is across interaction design and with a specific focus on cities and how technology and people interact in cities. I'm very passionate about trying to create a better world, like most academics are, I suppose. So the foci, I suppose, the pain points we're trying to tackle these days are around, on the one hand, sustainability, resilience, climate change, circular economy, all of that kind of stuff. And then on the other hand, the other big area is data privacy, security, sovereignty, data care.
And I should mention that Marcus has been on the podcast before, but not for a while. I was just having a look and you were actually episode 4, which is amazing, a long time ago. And actually, you helped me get a lot of my earlier guests. So thank you for that.
Yeah, awesome.
It was amazing. And we talked about the nexus of people, place, and technology in episode 4. And that was, one of the very first episodes on the 26th of February in 2018. I've been meaning to get you back on podcasts ever since, and we've had lots of conversations. We've been on panels together. We've been talking, but I'm so excited to have you back on the podcast. So let's go to, we heard about your background. We heard about what you're passionate about. How did you get into this kind of smart cities, smart community space?
I researched in my PhD, so this goes back to 2002, very early days. I researched community networks, as it was called back then. And it was an interesting time because most other academics were talking about things like cyberspace and the global village that is somewhere there in virtual space rather than the real space. And so there was quite a distinct separation between what's online, what's offline, or what's digital, what's physical. And I started researching in a way the complete opposite, which is kind of how do we bring them together and what's the impact of the internet on place? What's the impact of everything online on neighborhoods, on people in apartment buildings was my specific topic. So I kind of got into this smart city space before it all kind of started, because we were looking at things like urban computing, ubiquitous computing, community networking, people setting up their own Wi-Fi networks, like mesh networks in the early days, and also what's the kind of interactions and the content and the communication between people that are not just based on interest, it's actually based on physical proximity. Like the question was really a very old question in sociology, which is why would you talk to your neighbor? You know, do you knock on their door to borrow milk and sugar or whatever? Is that actually still something that happens these days? So it was really interesting to debunk some of the expectations that the internet back then would create all of a sudden these Hobbit style shires, the kind of, you know, the idea of a village, of an urban village, and perhaps giving it a bit more of a contemporary spin and an expectation. And fast forward to today, we got, you know, platform urbanism. We got the kinds of walled gardens of corporations that are setting things up. We got notions such as software sorted geographies, which is about how the different apps that we use and the recommender systems that we use and the different algorithms that underpin them are actually sending us places which can prevent, you know, serendipitous encounters and shared encounters from happening. And so it was a very kind of, you know, being there at the right time in the right spot with a research trajectory that was looking into the combination of the physical and the digital. And so that's kind of how the smart city in a way happened around me whilst we were still doing it already since 2002, because the smart city term, I think, only really got going with IBM's global marketing campaign and McKinsey and so on, and others jumping on that bandwagon maybe around 2012. So we had already been doing this for 10 years by then.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I'm just thinking, like, you know, our digital devices and things we do on the internet, etc., just nudging us towards certain behaviors as well. And then that actually can have, you know, real impacts in our physical, the way we design places and all that type of stuff. So it's so interesting. And I think we often, maybe we don't think about that until you have an opportunity, or you come up with this opportunity, this research piece. And, you know, obviously not going to cover everything, absolutely everything in 2002, you said? It's starting with that and then, yeah, continuing to shift and evolve. And yeah, I guess the thinking stays the same, but then the technology comes in and does different things to us. So
yeah. It goes hand in hand. I think we get a lot of inspiration, especially because we are in a design space. It's not just for us to make sense and understand and collect data and analyze it and then leave it at that. The whole beauty of being in a school of design and in the QUT design lab is actually that we also then very motivated to act on those insights, to actually then build prototypes, come up with design interventions, and also work a lot with community groups and with artists and activists and so forth, because it's often them who are challenging the status quo. There is a push by the technology improving and accelerating, and there's new features, but then it's actually the more interesting kinds of things happening at the fringes that are kind of causing these weak signals, and we're very interested in listening to those.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I had a conversation with somebody earlier. I can't remember who it was now. I think it was Rohan Light from New Zealand, and he talked about that as well. That if we look towards the artists and the creatives, you can actually see some of, you know, the issues within society expressed in that way, whereas we may not be able to articulate it in even just talking about it, but we can see what those issues are. And how do we bring then the smart community, you know, approach and bring those artists into the conversation as well?
Yeah, I very much agree.
So what is a smart community to you?
A smart community is, well, my answer would probably be similar to people asking me what's a smart city. I like the term smart communities, obviously, because there is a much more human as well as humane dimension to it. But smart, in a way, is often translated in common parlance to be about technology and a whole bunch of innovative ways that, algorithms can create automation and optimization and efficiencies and all these big words. Whereas I think what I would consider to be really smart is if a community actually realizes what would be a very progressive governance model for us. So the smartest things or the most exciting things from a research point of view that we are looking at right now are not so much about any one piece of technology. It's actually about really interesting ideas for governance. Like one of the longest common denominators in the research over all these years has been governance and issues of governance and issues of how communities kind of form consensus through deliberation. How do they make sense of what's happening in the world and come up with decisions? Like if you think of any kind of one problem, even big problems like climate change, arguably a lot of knowledge we have already gathered through science. Scientists know a lot about climate change, and they are at a point where they're very frustrated because they are pointing the finger at things that have already been published in the 70s and 80s, and we haven't acted on that. That's not because of a lack of more science, it's because of a lack of governance, or at least functioning governance models that actually act on those insights for the betterment of humanity and the planet. And so I think smart communities are really those that find really innovative, progressive ways to challenge the status quo in governance models.
Yeah, I think that's so important. And when you talk about governance, it's something I've been working with as well. We're talking about both the, overarching governance of how our communities function, but then like the accountabilities, the responsibilities of when we are collecting, acting on data, what are those responsibilities in it? And then in turn, the accountability, where does that fall? So then people actually have know what their role is in how to solve some of these problems. Because I think you're right. And if we use, climate change as an example, there may be, like you said, lots of science out there. And people are getting frustrated because we're not acting on it, but it's actually setting up, well, whose responsibility is it to do these things and how's it going to happen? And which obviously, that's oversimplifying the whole system, but it comes down to responsibilities and whose role is it?
Yeah, very much so. Yeah, I agree. I think there's also a risk that within a lot of the existing governance models, there seems to be a tendency to do tokenistic things, right? So if people in decision-making roles know there's something to be done about climate change, then pointing the finger at technology or science and saying, here's a little piece of science that seems to be making our, light switches more efficient, or fuel consumption is being reduced a little bit, etc. That all sounds really good to the average person. But what's actually more problematic is that we are not getting towards net reductions and a more net positive kind of approach to the built environment. This idea of net positive design has been pioneered and coined by Janice Birkeland. I should have probably looked up whether Janice has been on the podcast, and if not, I would very much recommend Janice as someone to interview. She used to be here at QUT. It's now based in Melbourne. The idea of net positive is really about the expectation that the built environment isn't just about reducing harm, reducing just our footprint a little bit, but still pushing ahead with growth and more numbers and building more things that then in the lump sum or the sum total is still accelerating us towards a planetary ecocide. So Janice's notion of net positive is actually having an expectation of architects, urban planners and designers to come up with a plan for the city to in itself make a contribution to the planet, whether it's producing more energy than it consumes, whether it's producing more habitat than it's taking up, habitat not just for humans, but more than humans. And so the list goes on. And that's actually a really, and probably a far more complex challenge, because you can't easily do this just with technology innovation. You've got to go back to that, Pandora's box of governance, because that's where the hairy kinds of big, audacious kinds of problems lie that we need to tackle.
Mm-hmm. Okay, well, let's dive into some of the things that you've been working on. Tell us about some of the projects, the most exciting ones that you've been working on lately.
Sure. So I mentioned those two big themes, one around sustainability, the other around data. So maybe I'll dive into the data one first. I think data obviously plays a huge role in smart cities and smart city analytics. A lot of people talk about digital twins these days, as well as all the associated possibilities from machine learning and algorithmic analysis and urban informatics and urban science. In our work right now, we are specifically interested in the way that data needs to be rethought beyond just a technical kind of raw material that feeds all this kind of analysis. So a project initiative that we've been pulling together, it's called Data Care. And the term in a way describes a much more value-driven approach towards city analytics. One of those values is access in the sense of inclusivity and participation. What we mean by that is, I think, nicely illustrated if you imagine these control centers that have been, photos of which have popped up in the media whenever the smart city term comes up. There's that, control center in Rio or another kind of intelligent hub where you see a lot of data scientists operating in front of terminals and doing very important things. What we want to do is find design approaches that take that inside out so that ordinary people, lay people, they are not specifically trained in data science, small businesses, community groups, etc. They find a way to unlock the power of city analytics for their own purposes. And what we found is that a lot of push for that comes from the open data movement. But the problem with the open data movement is trying to find a needle in a haystack, because it's very much a push-driven approach of filling up data warehouses and data repositories with as many data sets as possible. And then the KPI of success is like, how many data sets have you accumulated in what time frame? And I've heard, colleagues in both industry and government lament the fact that the way that success is evaluated is through the number of data sets rather than the actual successful use cases. So what we actually are trying to do with this project is turn this around into from a push paradigm to a pull paradigm, where we first work together with citizens, community groups, small businesses to understand their domain, and then pairing them up with both the technical interfaces as well as the human interfaces as an intermediary to connect between their expert domains, where they're coming from, and then the power of data and what might be relevant data sets that then get pulled into that analytics space, rather than jumping into this, big bale of hay and trying to find that needle. So one of those approaches in data care is that paradigm shift. And then just quickly, the other one that is also, I think, really important is around privacy and sovereignty. And what we've noticed in that regard is that a lot of the commentators and kind of industry leaders, they are starting now to take privacy really seriously, and they kind of look at, international examples like the Sidewalk Labs waterfront development in Toronto and how it was abandoned. And there was a lot of community backlash against all that approach towards automation through data. But what I then usually see as a response to that is just, we make it very secure. So the response to some of the issues around privacy and sovereignty is a response coming out of encryption and security, cybersecurity. I think that is actually missing the point and not understanding what we are talking about when we talk about privacy and sovereignty in data. And so that is the other kind of part of that project, that is debunking this myth that all we need to do to solve the privacy problems is very secure connections. No, it's actually a bit more complicated.
Yeah, I agree with you. And I was on a privacy panel recently at Smart City Summit with two privacy experts. And we had that exact conversation where it's actually those two, your privacy and security get, that they're the same thing, but they're actually completely different things. They get lumped together, which, to some aspects makes some sense, but actually they are very different. And I think, it's so interesting. And I'm glad to see that more people are talking about privacy. I mean, talking is the first thing, but the action is the next thing. But then also having those privacy professionals and other people involved in these conversations at the very beginning is so important, because we don't want to necessarily, halt progress on certain things because we don't know what it's going to be with privacy, but actually designing that privacy in the start so then you can have best of both worlds or balancing or whatever the case may be. So then people feel safe, secure, and that we're not being, our privacy isn't being exploited. But then also thinking about, well, and I know I've had lots of conversations with people, particularly where they're like, I don't care, I don't do anything wrong. But, and Nicole Stevenson is one of the privacy professionals I have a lot of conversations with. We need to also decouple privacy and like criminality, that they're actually, we shouldn't be talking about them in the same sentence, because, you have the right for privacy, whether you're doing everything 100% right or not. That's not the conversation that we should be having. It's actually completely different. So, which I found really insightful talking to her about that.
No, that's a really good point. It also really nicely dovetails with our thinking here around that data care model. So what it's trying to do in a nutshell is actually create a physical space. The way we're thinking about it is like a living lab or a facility, really, like a space that can be booked. You can hire it, you can go there. It might be a space that is provided by the city, by a local government. It could also be attached to a local library. And what that space does is it allows, obviously, a whole bunch of data literacy training, raising awareness, all that kind of stuff that would be common sense. But in addition, what I think I'm most excited about is that opportunity, one, to shift from that data push to that data pull approach, where people can start actually engaging with data on their own terms and using their own kind of domain context. That will then expose them to some of the benefits as well as some of the pitfalls and challenges. And then the other one to it is actually much more designed for local governments themselves, maybe state governments as well, but it's using speculative design methods to try and anticipate the kinds of regulatory and policy responses needed. So a lot of the time, the design process is geared towards the technology. What we are doing here is actually flip it and focus on policy design and regulatory design. So imagine, City X is being approached for a new investment and it's on the table of the councillors around the boardroom, and they need to make a decision whether they're going to invest, $200 million in another cool smart city project. And the vendor would have provided all the yummy stuff about scenarios and how cool it's going to be. What is actually missing is a more sophisticated and rigorous core design approach that is enabling decision makers, politicians, policymakers to anticipate both the utopian as well as the dystopian possibilities along a spectrum. And that's exactly what speculative design approaches can do for them. So the data care space can be configured to enable that, where cities are then anticipating the kinds of ways a technology is used by the different stakeholders across the city, and they are accompanying the deployment of any one new smart city investment with the appropriate regulatory and policy response at the same time, rather than to be reactive and doing it ad hoc once the technology is there. And then we realized, we didn't think that this would happen. What are we going to do now? And then quickly, put something together. So and we've now started testing this with doing interviews with a whole bunch of people in government and industry. And they're really excited about this idea of doing a policy core design approach for smart cities.
That's so interesting and so important. And I think it's stuff we may have spoken about early on, but now it's great to see it like coming into a bit of action. And I also think that there's lots of there's the regulation and policy, but then also the change management implications internally for a local government as well. Okay, if we did have this data, if we do have to collect this data, if we are going to share this data, what does that mean for the asset management people? Like, what does that mean for the business processes? How do we make sure that someone's responsible for it? The governance, I suppose, is really key. But that sounds all super interesting. And I have heard of the data care project before, and I can't wait to dive a bit deeper into it as well myself, because it's something I've been starting a research project with a local council here. And it's some of the conversation I'm starting to have about, I'm going to do some analysis on asset management data, but what does it mean to open up that data? Looking at a spreadsheet, is that useful for the rest of the community? Or is it actually making sure that they can access it? It's already giving them something rather than, like you said, finding that needle in a haystack. So that's really important.
Yeah.
I'm keen to hear about your sustainability projects.
Yes. The sustainability, well, we're actually now starting to refer to it as a post-anthropocentric approach, or like a cohabitation approach. The term sustainability itself has obviously been around for a long time, and very often it gets equated with a lot of greenwashing, as I kind of alluded to, this idea that if only we have a little bit of efficiency gains, then that'll do. What we are trying to actually grapple with is a bit of introspection that we've engaged in, because designers are very much part of the problem. I believe, we are in a way complicit in the way we launch and design and develop new technology. And then that technology might create certain, advancements on sustainability KPIs within a geographic area like a city. But what we then conveniently ignore is the kinds of atrocities in the making of those, in the raw materials, in the exploitation of workers, in rare minerals, metals that are being mined in an unregulated fashion in the Congo in order to get cobalt, which is used in lithium-ion batteries. When you look at the other end of the life cycle, there's the problem of e-waste and a whole bunch of IoT devices piling up in places like Accra in Ghana. So whilst we are then congratulating ourselves and tapping ourselves on the shoulder and saying we've accelerated our sustainability KPIs in the city because of the rollout of air pollution sensors or other kinds of IoT whiz-bangery, what we are missing is that more holistic perspective that actually looks at the planetary health and well-being. That is really what is meant by sustainability if you were to look at it in a much more genuine manner. And so from that point of view, what we are trying to do here is learn from theories and research contributions in the environmental humanities, as well as looking into a number of indigenous epistemologies. So for instance, a notion that is very simple, like a linear growth trajectory, is very much embedded in a Western way of thinking. Whereas if we consider how Aboriginal Torres Strait Islanders of Australia would have lived here in Australia on their traditional lands, then you would come across things that we hear about in acknowledgements of country, which is care for country and stewardship and being very much connected to place. And I think those notions are really, really useful in order for us to approach a much more genuine commitment to sustainability, not just this kind of Western greenwashing notion, but actually switching from a linear thinking model to what I'd call a relational thinking model. It does seem to be compatible with that term, the circular economy, because it's circular. But similarly, when a lot of people these days talk about circular economy, they just talk about the circularity of waste flows, whereas what we are talking about is the interconnectedness and the entanglements of the entire planetary ecosystem. So that actually prompts us having to decenter the human in our design process. So what we've been doing for over a decade is human-centered design. And even today, human-centered design seems to be the kind of the pinnacle of what we aspire towards. We want it to be human-centered if you compare it to the alternative of technology-centered. Okay, so we don't want it to be just, tech-led or technocratic. We want it to be much more towards, our own human experience. Well, I think the next step is to abandon that human-centeredness as well and approach something that is planetary-centered. And we call that the more than human approach, which borrows on more than human theory. So that's an existing concept that borrows from a lot of scholarship in the environmental humanities. And without me being obviously an indigenous researcher, we do work with colleagues from an indigenous background. And what is really fascinating is the compatibility between indigenous ontologies and ways of making sense of the world, and how that actually gives us a huge opportunity to decolonize and rethink the way that design operates in the space of the built environment, especially the built environment, because it's obviously the stuff that humans put into place. And so there's that place notion again.
Mm-hmm. So interesting. And I think, it is a really, I guess, important point that, and we talk a lot about, being about the people, but then how do we as people connect with not the places, but the environment that we live in? And I had Emma Lee, who's an Indigenous researcher down in Tasmania, on the podcast. She started off at 2021 for us, actually. And I was really fascinated with, I guess, her storytelling ability. Just, you draw in because it's such a deep connection, and you can feel it when you're talking to her, even through a, computer screen. And just, getting us to think a little bit differently about the notion of decolonization and that type of thing. So, really interesting. And really interesting to bring it into this smart community space as well, because, we do have technology, we do have built environment, we have all these things, we can't ignore them. So how do we, I guess, change our approach to really, what's the word, involve all of those pieces of our lives in one so we can be more holistic?
Oh, yeah, totally. I mean, we asked in the beginning, what's my understanding of the term smart communities? And I started talking about governance, but it actually is kind of going full loop and closing back into that earlier discussion, because I believe that the ability for the Indigenous peoples of Australia to having lived and continuously occupied and survived and cared for this country for 65,000 years, well, there's your smart community, right?
Yeah, I totally agree. I feel like we could talk for a long time on this, but I will shoot us into the future and talk about emerging trends. But I think this is one of them, right? What are the emerging trends that people aren't talking about enough?
I do think that those two are now gaining momentum. We've been working on that more than human theme for a couple of years now. We had our first academic workshop in Belgium in 2018, and there is now more and more momentum building in the design area and also in the area of smart cities. And also in that space of data that we discussed earlier, I think that notions of data sovereignty and then how things translate into smart urban governance is actually getting a lot of traction, a lot of excitement. So I definitely think there is a bit of a gear shift from the smart city originally as, a big technology piece, and then it was more about the kinds of business opportunities and how local governments could look at it more from a procurement and investment point of view. But now we are getting to that stage where it's about these much more kind of humanities, social science topics rather than an engineering problem.
Yeah, and I think it's also bringing, for me, being an engineer, bringing the skills that engineers are actually quite good at, but bringing them to the community so we can use them to work on those really human problems. Yeah,
definitely.
And vice versa as well.
Yeah, I mean, our approach in the lab has always been very interdisciplinary in terms of the combination of skills and theories and backgrounds, but it's also the lateral thinking and that kind of joining the dots, because you do have to go between the domain of the humanities to the domain of technology and engineering and back and forth and so forth. And it's a skill set to be able to do that quite, in an agile fashion, to shift granularity levels as well as to shift disciplinary spheres in order to, navigate and negotiate these different worlds.
Yeah, I agree. I think it's an underrated skill set that it's like a bit like project management. You never complain about a project manager until you have a bad one.
Sure.
But anyway, that's another bugbear of mine. Well, it's been so great to chat with you, Marcus. I really appreciate you coming back onto the podcast, and I look forward to catching up. We'll have to catch up in person sometime soon.
That'll be awesome.
Yeah, we'll work it. But I just have one last question, which is, how can people connect with you?
I'm easily, I think, discoverable on the internet. The easiest way would be Twitter. I'm Sunday 9 p.m. on Twitter. I'm also on LinkedIn. If you type in my name plus QUT, my staff profile, our email address comes up. You can find out about our publications on the QUT ePrints repository. So there's a whole bunch of ways to connect, and would be very much interested in hearing what the audience has to say if there's, commentary and replies, responses, further ideas on this topic.
Absolutely. So we'll put all the links in the show notes so people can click away and find you. And thank you again for coming onto the podcast, and we'll talk soon.
Thank you for having me. Awesome. Thanks, Joey.
Bye.
Are you looking for an engaging speaker, MC, or facilitator for your next big event? Then we've got you covered. Zoe is a go-to speaker, MC, and conversation facilitator with a difference. She's a master at simplifying the complex and making connections you might never see. Book Zoe for your next event. Email hello@mysmart.community or head over to her speaker page, www.mysmart.community/speaking.
Thanks so much for listening to the Smart Community Podcast. Show notes for this episode and all other episodes are available on our website, mysmart.community/podcast. If you have any questions for us or any of our guests, you can email hello@mysmart.community. You can also find us on the socials. We are on LinkedIn and Twitter @SmartComHQ. That's com with 2 M's. If you are enjoying the podcast, please hit subscribe so you never miss an episode. And we would love for you to leave us a rating and review at wherever you listen. This really helps us reach more ears and eyes, so thank you for your support. As always, we hope you enjoyed listening to this episode as much as we enjoyed making it.
The Smart Community Podcast is what you're looking for.